Hi, everyone. Welcome to the International Waters Network webinar on groundwater and equity, exploring barriers to access in the Global South. We just wanted to thank everyone for joining us here today, and we have a great panel ready for you. We're just going to give people a few more minutes until we start in case someone is running late, and we'll be with you in just 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you again for joining us. Ready for you. I'm just going to give people a few more minutes until we start. Well, okay, everyone, I think we're going to get pretty close to starting here. We have a little technical glitch with one of our speakers, but we can continue with the other two that are already with us today. I just want to remind everyone that this is the International Waters Network webinar on groundwater and equity, exploring barriers to access in the Global South. And what we are is we have a number of partner universities and institutions that have come together to jointly explore and address issues around water equity. These include the University of British Columbia, University of Minnesota, University of Western Cape in South Africa, IHA Delft, WaterNet, Justica Heritica, New Partnership for Africa's Development, Sachi Waters, Forum of Water Policy Dialogues on Water Conflict in India, and Bezrat University. As you may have known from some of our emails, if you're on our emailing list, or if you follow us on Twitter, what we are is a group that works on multifaceted approaches to addressing water issues. We promote collaborative and comparative research on urban water resilience. We foster knowledge mobilization through academic and policy dialogue, including this webinar. We're building an extensive network of expertise and experts who are available to enrich capacity and to help with graduate training at the partner institutions. So we're really happy to have you here, and thank you for tuning in and joining us. We have a really great panel of just leading experts who have a lot of experience in these questions around groundwater and equity. And we're going to be looking at some case studies and be able to kind of tease out some of the broader theoretical questions. So we hope to have Professor Francis Cleaver and Dr. Luke Whaley, each at the University of Sheffield. We also have Professor Michelle Kooy at IHE Delft.
Can you hear us?
We have Dr. Hans Komakech at Nelson Mandela Institute of Science and Technology in Arusha, Tanzania. So I see that we have Professors Cleaver and Dr. Whaley with us. So thank you for joining us. Excellent to have you with us today.
Sorry, we're late.
No problem at all. No problem at all.
Operator problem here.
Totally happy. All right. So what we're going to do here today is we're going to have a couple of presentations from our speakers, and they're going to be kind of talking and using PowerPoint. And then afterwards, we're going to try to engage some audience questions. So if anyone has questions, you'll see there's a chat box, and you can just chat at the bottom of the YouTube page. So please just pose it there. And, if you have a question for a single panelist or for the whole group to discuss, please put it there, and we'll talk about that after the presentations. And we'll hope to have this as about a 1-hour event. So we'll be done around 5 p.m. Universal Coordinated Time. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is have our first presentation from Professor Michelle Kooy. And then we'll have Professor Dr. Hans, and then we'll go to the team at Sheffield with Professor Cleaver and Dr. Whaley. With that in mind, Professor Kooy, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking to you today with Hans Komakech, who's right now sitting in Arusha in Tanzania. And we're going to be talking about groundwater inequity in cities of sub-Saharan Africa. And we're going to be using the city of Arusha in northern Tanzania as a case study, mainly to ask questions about what is the relationship between groundwater access and inequalities in access to water. So not presenting a lot of research data, but hopefully provoking a lot of questions for you to also begin discussing. Okay, now I'm trying to figure out, sorry, we did practice this yesterday, but now I have to figure out how to show my slides.
The second one down, the green.
Yeah, okay. Correct.
That's.
Do you see what I'm seeing? Yeah, I'm seeing many different.
Good.
Sorry, Scott, can you confirm? Are you?
Yeah, the PowerPoint looks fine. Just make the PowerPoint full screen.
Okay. Yeah, I see like 12 different screens on here. Okay. But I will just go to my own full screen and talk from there. Okay.
Yes, no, it's fine.
So the research that we're going to be reflecting on today comes out of a larger project. It's a 4-year research project on unlocking the potential of groundwater for the poor. And this is a larger program by DFID. I think also Francis and Luke are speaking to their reflections or reflecting on their project experiences also in this research funding program. And our project is called T-Group, which is a rather awkward acronym for talking about transitions in sustainable groundwater management. We're doing that in cities in Dodoma, in Ghana, in Arusha, Tanzania, and also in Kampala in Uganda. And essentially what we're interested in is the relationship between ecological sustainability and equity. And also just a side note that the research we're reflecting on in this webinar is being led by Hans out in Arusha, but drawing from master's students and researchers also now still based at Arusha in the Nelson Mandela Institute for Technology, Science and Technology. Okay, so why is this important? Why do we want to talk about the politics of distribution or the relationship between groundwater access and inequalities in water access? Well, obviously, well, not obviously perhaps, but not obviously to you, but we hope obvious to everybody soon, is that reliance on groundwater is increasing. And it's increasing in cities. And we know that the percentage of access to improved water supply as it's measured by the JMP is increasing more rapidly in other sources, which includes groundwater, but not piped water. Right? So we know that less than half people living in southern cities now access piped water on premises. And this means that self-supply systems are growing. Just a few more figures to hammer home why this is important as well. So if we look globally, we see 2.8 billion people relying on groundwater. Francis and Luke will probably speak to the significance of this in rural areas or perhaps for irrigation. And what we're speaking today is 1.5 billion urban residents who now rely on non-centralized groundwater supply. So this means it's not groundwater flowing through centralized pipe networks, but it's self-supply systems. And this is the fastest growing category of improved access to water across sub-Saharan Africa. Know that access to groundwater is very different, or you have access to very different kinds of groundwater. So if you see the pictures on the right-hand part of the slide, we see gated residential areas which have access to deep boreholes, which they then use their own reticulated pipe systems. But we also see underneath that in lower income urban settlements, individual boreholes, which are then stored through buckets that nearby neighbors come and fill up. One example of this process of urbanization happening across sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking at Arusha, which, as I said, was in northern Tanzania. Right now it has an urban growth rate of almost 4%, so the city is growing rapidly. And the existing water supply system is inadequate to meet demands. So there are daily shortages, and the reliance on groundwater self-supply is increasing. Increasing population and rapid urban development due to tourism, due to direct foreign investment, and due to agriculture in the area. So the city depends on groundwater. Over 70% of the population right now is dependent on groundwater. But as we also want to reflect on, or what I want to call your attention to today, is that there are many different kinds of groundwater being accessed within the city. Students did a survey across different neighborhoods, different types of neighborhoods in the city, and they came up with 28 different household water supply combinations. So 28 different ways of combining a shallow dug well, a borehole, piped water connection, piped water from a kiosk or a standpipe, and also packaged drinking water. So what we want to ask about, or what we want to reflect on, is what does this mean for equity, water equity? Everybody has similar access or equitable access to water supply. What are the, in other words, another way of asking this is, what are the politics of distribution outside of the piped network? Right? So we know that the majority of urban residents around the world rely on different combinations of sources. Groundwater is a growing growing significance of one of these sources, but yet I think we know little. Maybe perhaps people who are listening can tell me differently. And Hans can also talk to this later, about the differences in access and what this means for the degree of continuity of supply, reliability, and also quality of groundwater access. And why should we be concerned about this? If we're concerned in meeting the targets for the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically Goal 6.1, this is calling for equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water. And if in sub-Saharan Africa, and if in urban areas, the type of access to improved sources coming through groundwater, we should be concerned with what are differences in access to groundwater. So the pictures that you can see here in the right-hand part of the slide, they display two of the rather glaring differences in types of groundwater used in the city of Arusha. So one is of a spring, contaminated with E. coli, but also with nitrates or with fluoride. And below we see a housing complex who has a central borehole which drills into the contained aquifer and provides a much better quality of water. Now I'm going to hand over to my partner, to Hans Komakech, sitting in Arusha, and he's going to take the presentation from here.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. This is Hans from Arusha. I will try to also share with you my screen so that we can discuss from where Michelle has stopped. I hope everyone is able to see my slide reading on fecal contamination. Now this the discussion that is.
But can you make the page full screen for us?
Sorry.
Can you make it the full screen? Fill up the whole screen with that. With your PowerPoint.
I have.
Put it in presenter mode.
Yeah, it's in just a second. I stop sharing. In my case, it's in a presentation mode already, but just a second. Is this okay?
Yes, but what you want is the I believe presenter mode is you know as though you were presenting on a overhead projector.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. I have put it on a presentation mode from my side here. I see like showing my screen.
Yes.
So you should be able to see, I guess. Are you able to see?
Yes, we can see, but I was just hoping you could make it full screen so we could see it in a larger way, like we practiced yesterday.
Okay. It's actually full screen on my side. Just a second.
Well, I think you have it in commentator mode right now, and what you want is to make it presenter.
Just a second. Sorry for the. Entire screen. Yeah.
No, it looked fine. So far, so good. But
Is that fine? Is that fine?
No, we were better off the first way. This gives us that weird infinite regression.
A weird diagram.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a.
Deep, but
The other one should be, in my case, it looks okay, but.
Okay, just go to the other one, and we'll just do that, and that's fine. It's better just to move along. There we go. That looks great. Thank you.
Is that better?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. Although now my screen is a bit messed up, but better. We can go.
Yes, please.
Hello.
Yes, please present.
Okay. Sorry for the mess up. So as I was taking from where Michelle has ended, and the indication there is that you could say everyone have good access to water because they can supplement in different combinations. But that also raises a number of issues. We have not talked about the water quality of these different aspects of water that people are accessing, given the rapid increase in demand. We've done some analysis, and we could see that most of the shallow wells have high level of fecal contamination. So many of them we could get high counts of fecal coliform. And these are the lower bottom figure there, which give you spatial variations of dark wells and in terms of fecal coliform count. We also tried to drill boreholes that we were monitoring, and we could see that within the same range of depth, within 5 to 30 meters, you will still have the same kind of high level of fecal contamination. So, and this is the water that people who don't have a sufficient high level of income would depend on. And when we compound that with the issues around whether people know about the use of or treatment of their water before they use it, And a majority of people actually could say that they are not treating their water, so they consider this water from the well relatively safe. So it raises a number of questions on what dimension of equity, or would we say groundwater, can be used to reduce lack of access to water, pipe water supply. And there are a number of cases that have been reported, like diseases, cholera being most common things in Tanzania, and particularly also in our study area. We have also looked at things around nitrate concentration. Michelle already mentioned it earlier on. Most of the shallow wells, we have very high nitrate concentration, reaching up to 120 milligram per liter. It's because the city does not have very good sanitation facilities, and most people are relying on on-site sanitation. And the wastewater systems does not treat the current collected wastewater sufficiently. So you have a lot of leakage and nitrification of this wastewater in the groundwater that are being used. And the area being a volcanic, also have high concentration of fluoride. So in cases where I reach up to 50 milligram per liter, but this is rather random. It compounds the impact of or the elements of fecal contaminations of the available groundwater sources. Now, yeah, so if you look at how groundwater is combined, of course, there are some people use it maybe in the swimming pool, like in the high urban, high neighborhood end, or some people just use it for drinking water. So you see here different kind of pictures that will show you what kind of usage of this groundwater is. This other figure here indicates the different location where the city water authorities have been able to drill boreholes, up springs to meet the. But if you look at it with respect to the fact that the inhabitants or the people are also trying to drill boreholes, issues. On the one hand, you could say that the city water authority want to limit private self-supply because it will limit their businesses. In that water will not be supplied if people already have their boreholes. But you also could look at it that it raises another issues of when everyone is pumping, then you're talking of groundwater level decrease that could contribute to another dimensions. And for a richer and a city water authority, that might seem a pretty fair game, but for a poor neighborhood or a household, that also springs might begin to dry up, another different kind of inequity in access to groundwater, but also to pipe water networks. And we have seen in another or relative study that we are not presenting here that the expansion of the city is also encroaching on the, and this is going to compound on those level of inequities that arrive from the city.
Hans, can I ask you to advance your slide? I think we're still on the fecal contamination slide, and I think you've moved past that a little bit. Is that correct?
Yeah. So
just to make sure you're moving the slides along so that we're on the right.
Moving slide along is a bit strange that my slide doesn't move with you because yeah. So.
You know what might work?
Moving my slide along, so and I was quite a bit in it. So you still
there you go.
Are you in this slide now?
That looks like a nice map.
Sorry?
That's a good map.
Yeah. So that means you missed this this one also.
Okay. Thanks.
So yeah, so this is the place where I was talking about nitrate and high fluoride concentration. So if my slide didn't move on that side, mine was moving here. So you could see that in addition to fecal contamination, there is a high fluoride concentration in most of the groundwater. You can't say that this is because of anthropogenic activities, but these are natural background concentration. But it's random, so you can find places where it is relatively low, but also you can find places which are quite high. And I was giving here pictures that would show you different kind of uses of this groundwater that is combined with the pipe water. So you could see that they would use it for swimming pool and others, for lawn, different kind of activities that groundwater is subjected to. I was raising here a discussion about the fact that the city depends on groundwater demand to supply water to the population, but also that as more middle income or richer neighborhood invest in groundwater, it leads into a dynamics where there is some kind of competition for water, for groundwater in this case. So it might be in a situation where the city might move in drilling or private investment in the individual boreholes. But it could also lead to a situation whereby those who are dependent on the much shallower groundwater will lose out in this case, because as more is being pumped, then there's a drop in groundwater level. And I was linking that with a related study which found that the city is expanding in area where groundwater recharge is occurring. So we would expect a much lower groundwater level in the future. And in terms of inequality of access to groundwater, these dynamics will likely to shift the direction toward poorer neighborhood losing out in this struggle to get groundwater to meet gaps in demand. Then I put this, my slide is still advancing, and if not, let me know. Here is, you can see that this is a situation where the city tries to cope with the gap in water demand, and that they try to different sources to augment the demand. In principle, the city would want to get about 200,000 cubic meter per day, but this is not currently there. So you get about 40,000 cubic meter per day that's available. So there is quite a demand gap. And there has been an attempt to try and get some other sources, but this has so far not been successful. So the relying on groundwater in this case will continue to increase. So making water flow in one place, of course, has implications quality and quantity of water in another place. The point here is that how does the place authority or the private middle income change the dynamics of access to groundwater for different people in the city? And we see that the growing number of boreholes in the residential areas will possibly impact on the pipe water company interest to cross-subsidize in the neighborhoods that they could have cross-subsidized based on their investment plan that they make. So how the current rate of abstraction, of course, will affect different downstream users. We can't say much about it, but there is a likely impact that when you have more people investing in groundwater, then springs or swamps that are dependent on by downstream community may, or on the outskirts of the city, may not be existing in the near future, and only raising in the urban area. This slide just tries to raise some of the issues that I've already discussed, but as a point here is that as the city also tries to fill water need in the town and drill boreholes, but it's also pushing out into other areas like agriculture to try and look for water, and this raises all kind of discussion between city and agriculture in terms of water access to meet the increasing demand. I think that is our last slide for now, and that can take us to a discussion. Sorry for the mix-up in the early part of the presentation.
No, it's okay. And we can try to make these PowerPoints available on our website. So that way, anyone who's interested and wants to follow along can go ahead and download the PowerPoint and sort of follow along in that way. We've moved about halfway through our webinar here today, folks. And now I'd like to change this over from the team. Thank you very much, UNESCO IHE Delft. Sorry, use the old name there. And move you over to University of Sheffield with Professors Cleaver and Dr. Whaley.
Can you hear us okay, Scott?
Sounds great.
And sorry, can you just remind me what button am I pressing this arrow?
Yes, over on the left side, second one down is green button.
I've got you, thank you.
There you go.
Okay, so we've entered infinite regress. And now...
You want to open the PowerPoint as we practiced.
Sorry.
No, there you go. And make it full screen.
Yes.
Excellent. That looks really good.
We good?
Yeah, looks great. Thank you.
Okay, so it's Frances Cleaver here, and I'm starting with the first part of the presentation. What we thought we'd talk about is take a step back from actual data on access or the actual facts about access, and talk about how do we understand access, how do we research it, in fact, because it's not necessarily an easy thing to ascertain. So our presentation is largely about an approach for trying to understand the dynamics of water access around groundwater and boreholes. Okay, so Michelle did a nice job of already setting this in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Obviously, that's the kind of broader context for us all. And she also highlighted the importance of groundwater, the increasing importance of groundwater, or perceived importance to securing this. And we're concerned in our research with rural areas in Africa, where it's seen that groundwater might offer some additional water security and possibilities of coverage, particularly in the context of the variability of surface water supplies, climate change, and so on. So groundwater and accessing groundwater is increasingly being seen as strategic significance in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so how are we going to understand access dynamics? You know, it's not just about queuing up there at the borehole to pump your water out. There's a number of sort of quite complicated social questions we need to ask in order to do this. The first one is thinking about how institutions shape access. And we're thinking there of institutions, maybe it's a water point committee, but maybe we're thinking of institutions village level, governance institutions, family setups, community kind of arrangements. And we're seeing the way, we're trying to investigate the way in which institutions shape access, constrain or enable access. And of course, we don't think of institutions as something static, but as something that shifts and changes over time. So institutions, for example, the Water Point Committee may be much more apparent at certain times of the year in the dry season than it is in the rainy season. So we need to have some kind of temporal element, some ability to catch the dynamics of institutional working. Secondly, we need to be interested in power relations. We know that accessing water and managing water is not just a technical exercise, but is infused with power relations. And here we're trying to kind of balance two things in that we're looking at village level dynamics. Who are the main decision makers in the village? Who gets preferential access to the water point, who influences the decision-making processes around access and the rules around water. But we're also thinking of wider systems of governance, and that might be the next level up, the local government, the enabling or supporting or facilitating environment provided by NGOs or government support. And it might also be at much, broader levels, at national level, the financial allocations to the rural water supply sector or to supporting boreholes, particular policies that promote community management and so on. So we're trying to keep these kind of two levels in sight at the same time, and they might indeed intersect. And then the third point is we're trying to understand outcomes in terms of access to water, how much water people get when they get it, what the quality of it is that when they get it, and so on. But we're also trying to understand how local people, water users, are able to influence decision making about water distribution and access, because of course that's quite significant in shaping these actual outcomes. Okay, so we're also involved in one of these upgrow projects, and ours is called Hidden Crisis, unravelling the current failure for future success in rural groundwater supply. We've got a number of partners that I haven't got time to mention here, but we're working in partnership with WaterAid as the practical partner in Malawi, Ethiopia and Uganda. Okay, the hypothesis of the project, we don't need to read this all out, is basically that there are multiple causes for the failure of boreholes. And the significance of this project is that the focus on boreholes is because there's been quite a lot of success over the last few years in increasing the coverage of boreholes. So the actual implementation of boreholes to increase people's access to water has been quite significant, but many of those boreholes fail quite soon after implementation. So about 30% of them are out of action at any one time, and that obviously reduces people's access. So the hypothesis of this project is that to understand the reasons for that borehole failure, they're likely to be complex, not just one technical reason, but an intersection of reasons: governance, finance, power, hydrology, and so on. And to understand this, we need interdisciplinary approaches. And it's one of the things we want to just talk about now is the challenge of interdisciplinary approaches to researching groundwater access. Okay, so we've implemented a research design which tries to look at both patterns of what's happening at boreholes, like what is happening and what are the issues, and that's being done through a wide survey of the functionality of 150 to 200 water points in each country. That's all been selected quite random, standardized selection and so on. And then we start to drill down to become more intensive as we go along. So after the first survey, we've done a second survey of a selected 50 water points to try and investigate not just what's happening, but why it's happening at particular water points. For example, looking in more detail at the dynamics of the water point committee or water management arrangement. And then delving down even further, we've got a few longitudinal studies where we're using diary keepers in each community to actually track what goes on over a whole year in relation to water access and village dynamics. And here we're trying to explain how water is accessed in the context of village life in all its kind of richness and complexity. And we should say that much of the fieldwork is being carried out by in-country social science researchers, but we also have a side-by-side team of physical science researchers following the same survey design, but from the hydrology and engineering side.
Okay, thanks, Francis. I'm going to take over now, and I just have a couple of slides which tries to put this research in the context of some of the challenges it faces from a social science perspective. And in doing so, I think it's worth just referring back to an earlier slide of Francis's, which spoke about the the complexity of the type of social science research we're interested in terms of the embeddedness of institutions, in terms of power relations, and the sort of research that is required in terms of in terms of trying to understand those dynamics, whilst trying to balance that with this type of large-scale water research project. So the first kind of category of challenges, if you like, that I'd like to speak about is around the issue of interdisciplinarity. And first of all, this really concerns the approach of the research and its design, whereby from a physical and a social science perspective, there are often very different understandings of what constitutes a good research design, really in relation to questions of what's robust. What is robust research? What is a robust research design? Where from a physical science perspective, the emphasis is often or always on kind of statistically significant research, which involves a degree of randomization and standardization, which doesn't always fit well with the sort of qualitative research that we're interested in. So for example, there's an emphasis on multi-countries, many districts, and on capturing a broad spectrum of situations rather than perhaps situations which may be telling us something because of their specificity. There's another challenge with interdisciplinarity which revolves around the ways in which people working in different disciplines understand each other on a project, and really the need for a common language. And here there's a challenge around, for example, the way in which the same concepts can be interpreted differently. So a good example would be the concept or the word agency, which when social scientists use that word, it often relates to an understanding of human agency, of the ability to exercise some degree of control, or in the world, some degree of action. Whereas the word agency for physical scientists may evoke the idea of some kind of government body, like, for example, in the UK, we have the Environment Agency. So there's very different ways of understanding the same concepts, and that makes speaking between disciplines quite a challenge. Another example would be in an early workshop we had on this project, one of the physical scientists stood up and in talking about the research design, they said that if you can't count it, it doesn't count, which is really a way of saying that if it's not quantifiable, if it's not a graph, then it's not science. And so that's a challenge, obviously, if from a social science perspective, you're not using a lot of quantitative data. There's also an issue around ethics, where from a physical science perspective, it may not seem that ethics is something that's really of much concern. Whereas from a social science perspective, it seems like it is of concern because you're working with people. But actually our experience on this project undermines that idea, and it shows that ethics is important for the entire project from an interdisciplinary perspective. For example, in our longitudinal studies, we initially started these studies by the physical and the social scientists working in the same communities, whereby the physical scientists would take apart the water point, put down some water level monitors in order to monitor water levels during different times of the day and the season as people pumped and used water. But this involved, of course, tampering with the water point. And whilst the community was sensitized and they were briefed, and it appeared that everything was fine, because we were also conducting longitudinal studies from a social science perspective, we had a number of diary keepers in those communities. And what their diary entries actually showed was that no one really understood what this process was about, why people were doing this to the water point, and it caused a huge amount of suspicion in the community and accusations that some members of the community who had been involved in this work, that they were, for example, perhaps trying to install a tap stand and start charging privately for people to use the water. So the point here is really just that water access is so crucial to many communities, so central to their lives, that in intervening with it in a research perspective, those sorts of effects ripple out throughout the entire community. Second category of challenges has to do with logistics in the field. This is the first point is a very kind of obvious or standard one, and it has to do with the timing of research, whereby the practical realities of trying to access rural communities, of transport, often necessitates that you work in the dry season. But in doing that, of course, you often only capture a partial reality of that situation because you fail to capture the sorts of dynamics that happen in other times of the year, for example, the wet season. There's also an issue around community willingness to participate in the research. And that really depends on a number of factors. For example, in this project, we had a phase of the research, the second phase, whereby we spent 2 days in each community, or our social science researchers did at least. But here a real challenge was that on the second day, it was very hard to get anybody to be willing to be involved in the research. And that's for a number of reasons, but perhaps most crucially, it's because of the sort of time demands on people's lives. And I think sometimes we feel from a research perspective that we may be visiting a community, and that may be a sort of one-off occasion, and it may be quite a special event in the context of that community. But again, referring back to our diaries and our diary keepers during our longitudinal studies on this research, what we actually found was that the nature of people's lives in the rural communities where we were working were replete with interventions and visits from NGOs, from researchers, from governments, to do with health, to do with agriculture, to do with finance, to do with training. And actually, you're just one of the many, many visits that people are called to gather in meetings, etc. And so the willingness for people to participate, therefore, is challenged by those sorts of dynamics. There's also a question around language and culture. In terms of language, there's the obvious one, whereby within a country, for example, like Ethiopia, one of the countries we're working, the researcher is very unlikely to be able to speak all of the languages in the districts or the waradas where they were working. And so there's a need to work with others, often at the district level, for example, the district water monitor or somebody like that, to act as a translator. But in doing that, you're incorporating somebody from the dynamic you're interested in, i.e. water governance, in the process of conducting the research, and that inevitably changes things. There's also the question with language around what sort of language is seen as appropriate, and in particular, the language of development. And one of our countries is notable for the way in which one of the researchers reported back on their findings in what they saw as an appropriate way of speaking about the details of the cases they were analysing. So there was an emphasis on the Waterpoint Committee, but not on any other wider arrangements. And there was the use of common terms like empowerment and ownership, which are very normative development terms. But what's been lost in that picture when speaking about water dynamics in this language? In terms of culture, there's questions around the appropriateness of the research, especially if you're doing a multi-country study. Is your research design appropriate in all countries, which vary in many different ways, and communities and cultures which vary in many different ways? And how does that sit with the imperatives of the physical science side? So, for example, in Survey 1, we were trying to do a survey whereby there was an emphasis on speed and efficiency, on visiting 3 or 4 communities in one day. And that was great from a physical science perspective. It was an emphasis on trying to get the time down. But from a social science perspective, when you're entering a community and you're trying to engage people in conversation, is that culturally acceptable to try and hurry up that situation? And then in terms of participants, it's really just the point that what you get in terms of information depends on who you talk to. And oftentimes when you convene a meeting or a focus group, it tends to be dominated, for example, by men or authority figures in the community, often people who actually don't have as much understanding of issues around water access and water point dynamics. And then the final category of challenges just has to do again with the nature of our research, which is really an intensive qualitative approach. And this is in relation to our social science researchers we have in Uganda, Ethiopia, and Malawi, where there's much emphasis on them generating sort of thick and rich descriptions of the life worlds of the participants in the research and of institutions and institutional dynamics around the water point. But of course, this is challenging in terms of people's level of English and writing abilities, as well as in terms of IT skills. And one of our researchers in particular hadn't really used a computer much before this particular project. And that's not saying anything about the researchers, but only that of course is a challenge to producing these sort of rich descriptions of community life. There's also obviously a need for a sort of theoretical understanding, not just of social science in general and of social science concepts and theories, but of water research in particular. And again, our social science researchers, who are really the linchpin that this project depends upon, had different levels of disciplinary understandings of social theory, and in one case, no real understanding at all. They came more from a physical background, and they did a really great job. But nonetheless, if you don't have that understanding, it challenges the way in which you look at the situation you're involved in and the sorts of insights you glean from it. There's a question around boundaries of study. Where do you demarcate your boundaries? If, as we're interested in the broader institutional landscape and people's livelihoods and wider systems of governance, well, that can become very unwieldy. It can become unmanageable. So how do you conduct research that's able to capture those dynamics whilst setting boundaries that make it manageable and that speak to the objectives of the project from an interdisciplinary perspective? And then finally, there's the question of analysis, and this really does hark back again to that interdisciplinary perspective. How do your results speak to the physical science side of the project, and what's changed or lost in that process? And so here there's often an emphasis on needing to quantify things. So in phase 1 of our research, we had to score our management arrangements, which is not something Francis and I are particularly comfortable with doing, but it helped to quantify and standardize across case studies. And the same sorts of need for simplification and abstraction are now filtering into other phases of our research. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It just changes the sort of data you produce, which can be very useful from an interdisciplinary perspective, but it challenges the sort of pure social science strand of things. So that was just a kind of a brief overview of some of the challenges of this sort of large multi-country interdisciplinary style of working. And again, not to reflect badly on it, but just to make those points noticed, because they are relevant when we think about this sort of research and we think about the sorts of findings it generates. But on the other hand, I think there's, as Francis has said on her side of the study, there's a need for this sort of interdisciplinary research in order to better illuminate the broad spectrum and the complexity of the barriers to people accessing groundwater in rural areas. So that's us.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think I learned a lot, and I hope that other people did as well. We're going to move now to the question and answer period. And I know a few of you have maybe mentioned that you're having some trouble on the chat getting questions posed. If anyone has trouble saying that you need to create a channel, what you just need to do is go up to, you'd be logged into your Google account, and then you go up to the top there on the top right. You click on your little icon where it shows your account, and then you can go from there to create a quick channel. It's nothing more than just setting up an account with YouTube and making sure everything's good, so that they know you're not just some sort of prank person. And there's some real person behind the questions. So go ahead and pose any questions you have there on the live chat. But if you're having any other troubles, please just send us an email at internationalwatersubc@gmail.com, or send us a tweet. I'm also monitoring our Twitter. So I guess the one question that you can see here from the live chat that we have, the first one is trying to draw out with Hans a little more information about the fecal contamination questions. Hans, can you answer that? If you have any more information about the dynamics of fecal contamination in surface water, particularly as it goes towards the groundwater? Hans, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'd not unmuted myself, but now I'm here. Yeah, yeah, surface water, of course, as it's passing through the town, is more heavily contaminated with fecal coliform than the groundwater. Lack of wastewater treatment and the use of on-site sanitations, but also the poor collections of systems. Solid waste management is still poor, but there's an improvement. Do you still hear me?
Yeah, it sounded good. Okay, that was helpful. Thank you. Thanks for able to give that kind of feedback. We have another question posed by Professor Layla Harris at the University of British Columbia for the group in Sheffield. To speak to any insight or other ideas, lines of inquiry that have come from related to groundwater that have come up, given that you've taken such a broad interdisciplinary approach to your studies? Can you speak to any of that? What are some new insights or lines of inquiry that have come up because of interdisciplinary work?
Well, I don't know if this is necessarily to do with interdisciplinary work, but I think one of the interesting things about the methodology we've employed has been these longitudinal studies and the attempt to incorporate participant diary keeping over the course of an entire year. And one of the sort of interesting but sideline features coming out of it, and I say sideline because it hasn't been requested of the researchers to look at these dynamics, is around spirituality and the supernatural and the ways in which those sorts of belief systems filter into water access and water management dynamics. And those sorts of questions around the supernatural and those cultural dimensions are often ignored by development research. And nonetheless, what's useful about our methodology is that in asking people from villages to record their own understandings of water dynamics in a community, is they can come out even if not requested of them.
I could just add something to that. There's a very specific watery thing that comes out of these diaries as well, which is that you know, we often calculate the demand on a borehole for water as the number of people in the community or something. But our diary keepers keep documenting all the funerals and celebrations and public events that go on that increase the number of users at their borehole, and then increase the queues and sometimes the conflicts over water. And I don't think we take that into account very well in the water sector when we're assessing demand and number of users and the available water supply for people. So that kind of really social perspective does throw some light on the actual access to water and ability to use water.
I can just come in and maybe also just quickly speak to that question in terms of the interdisciplinarity. What we have found, and one of the strengths of this project, is the fact that the physical and the social researchers work in the field together at all times, so that they're visiting the same communities at the same time in the same order. And that means that, for example, whilst a social science researcher may be having focus groups with community members, and they may be telling them of their understandings of the issue of the water point, and that may lead to allegations of others in the community for having done something wrong, and that's why the water point doesn't work, something along those lines. That's slightly spurious. The physical science team is at the same time unable to reveal issues to do with the physical water point or with hydrogeology, which actually says that regardless of what anybody above ground is doing, this particular water point is limited or its integrity is undermined because of these physical factors. And yet it plays out in a different way above ground within the community. So it's quite interesting to have those two sides of the story, if you like, saying slightly different things, but also talking about the same point in the same place.
Excellent. Thanks for that. That really helped draw it out a little bit more. You know, a quick follow-up on that. Could you speak a little bit more to what are the gender of the diary keepers, and, or, you know, to kind of give us a breakdown of that? And is there any kind of gender differences that you've drawn out from the types of how the diaries are maintained, how they're written out? Any insight from that?
So we have about, we're almost a year into having these diaries, and we have about a 50% success rate in terms of people who have actually maintained them, with an average of about 3 diary keepers in each community, the majority of whom are women. And it was a slightly unsystematic process of incorporating diary keepers in the first place, because it really relied on just the community meeting and understanding people who were, or identifying people who were literate enough to, and willing enough to keep diaries in the first place. So oftentimes those would be people who were somehow involved with water more than others in that community to begin with. And certainly there's a gender difference in terms of understandings of experience of the diary keepers. And as I say, the majority of diary keepers are women. And what you do get is a lot of understanding of the ways in which water access is incredibly difficult for most people because of the demands or over demand on a water point. and therefore issues around queuing and when you access a water point are really, really tough. So people going, in Budaka in eastern in Uganda, people going at midnight and finally queuing and finally getting access to the water point at about 5 in the morning in a poorly performing water point. So those sorts of gender dynamics really come out quite strongly for the women diary keepers. And the male diary keepers, we have several who also often are somehow involved in using the water point themselves. And it may be, for example, around issues of irrigation, where one man in particular was able to access the water point because he knew the local LC1 chairperson, and so he could use the water for irrigating his crops, even though other community members weren't particularly happy about this. So those sorts of issues around gender and access do come out through the diaries.
Excellent. Now, another question that's kind of come up is that, one of the major problems with groundwater research is a lack of data. And could you speak to both teams, speak to any types of data problem collections they've had, how they've bridged those gaps, sort of talked about that, Don't everyone speak at once.
Well, it's Frances here from Sheffield. I could just offer an observation that was one of the reasons that we felt the need to have a extensive survey, representative sample survey to start with, was that the existing database, there's been many attempts to compile national databases of functioning hand pumps or functioning water points and so on. And almost universally, they seemed out of date or deficient in some way. So that was a real problem, and that did affect our research design, the need to actually get what we felt was real and reliable data about functionality of boreholes.
Yeah, maybe I could also say something in relation to our work in Arusha, Hans here. Yeah, when it comes to groundwater, data is really a major problem. And of course, in Tanzania, grounds under the Basin Water Authority, and they are responsible for collecting data of all kind of uses, but also to monitor the variations or the groundwater levels over time. And this is often not the case because of the costs incurred. So you don't find sufficient data available to track what kind of access is there. We have invested in monitoring sites and also installed in a number of data loggers that would allow to complement information that is needed to understand better the dynamics of groundwater access in Arusha city. But of course, we have done some kind of mapping to check out what kind of groundwater people are using. But at a larger scale, I think this still remains a much bigger challenge when it comes to the dynamics around groundwater use or access to it.
Excellent. Could you speak a little more, Hans, about some of the other experiences of involving the community and getting them involved in the research process? Well,
actually, so we have involved communities at various stages in the research process. For this particular, we are looking at something we call experimenting with practical transition management. So here, although we have gone from the stage of getting people aware of what we are doing and the relevance of that particular research to them, and then also contributing through either the process of mapping of different groundwater use sites or taking part in the questionnaires that are being implemented. But we are also having these stages where we are doing knowledge disseminations and try to draw out things that we see and what people actually think is important. And in this process, we have seen cases where emphasis on quality on the researchers on one side is not the most important thing from the community side. Other people will say quality. It's better if people would access sufficient quantity of water, even if it is bad. So this involvement of community has allowed for different ways of looking at things. In fact, like tomorrow, we are going to be engaging at a city level discussion with different key stakeholders to digest the research findings within the T group. But we have also tried in other projects where we use gaming, particularly games, to try and the interaction between them and the different type of users within the particular systems. So those are the ways we have engaged communities. But of course, I see that there is an element which is not easy when it comes to monitoring groundwater, and I think it's important in that how community can monitor groundwater access and set some kind of management around it. So this is something we am particularly interested in, but it's not very easy because of the invisible nature of groundwater. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, everyone, we're going to go just a few minutes longer to give everyone a chance to ask some more questions. Again, you know, if you make a channel on YouTube, you can go ahead and ask questions. I know about a fourth of you have already asked questions, or you can send an email to internationalwatersubc@gmail.com.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm afraid I have to make a train, so I'll have to leave now. But the problem was, because we couldn't log on to Francis's computer, we're on my laptop, which has to come with me.
I totally understand. Well, then
we're very willing to answer questions by email if anyone wanted to follow up with us about the research.
Absolutely. Well, and as they say, anyone who's interested, just go ahead and follow up with Professors Cleaver and Dr. Whaley and ask more questions. And otherwise, we really appreciate your participation and help with us today. Really learned a lot, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, and sorry to have to bow out.
No problem. Okay, the last question that we have here on the plate for the Arusha team is, you know, could you please talk about some of the management implications for large privately managed groundwater issues? What are some governance problems that come from this? How can this be monitored better? Either part of the Arusha.
Maybe I can start very quickly before Hans can chime in. Just drawing some management challenges, just reflecting, I think, on some of the research results from Shabana Abbas, one of the MSc students here. She was also finding in some of the newer developed areas of the city where piped network was not yet available or was sporadically available. An individual homeowner, an entrepreneur, had decided to invest in a borehole and a reticulated pipe system. And she did that and provided to her neighbors. Now, of course, there's multiple challenges there. First of all, I think Hans will tell you it's illegal to do so. The provision of water lies with the authority of the state. But how do you get around how much money to charge, ensuring the quality of the water? And this is, of course, then the sustainability of the source itself and what kind of impact that has. Happening, and I think there's maybe not a lack of willingness, but there is a lack of engagement of these issues by water supply managers, by water governance scholars, because they are tricky, but you can't ignore them, because this is now how improved access to water is being provided at a growing rapid rate across cities in sub-Saharan Africa. Over to Hans if he wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think you have covered, Michelle. You have covered that question. Of course, to highlight a bit why supply of water would be not allowed in the case of Tanzania, in that the law says that if in order for you to distribute water, you need to be either a water authority or a registered community water utility. So if you're a private investor and you're supplying a number of neighborhoods, doing that illegally. But in the case of Arusha, where demand kind of outstripped supply, water market is quite an interesting thing for many businesses. So a lot of people are trying to get either into the water bottle markets, or they're getting into the pipe supply that would be going to Bowsers, because even in the high neighborhoods, supply is not really constant; it's intermittent. So there is but I think in terms of managing it, the capacity to follow all these changes is not there, and the water authority is currently still stuck in trying to figure out where is an add and how can I fix the leakage or losses in the systems. So it has been more on around water infrastructure or infrastructure improvement and looking for new sources than trying to engage with the dynamics of private supply. Meanwhile, the city authorities are more maybe interested in managing land access, which generate more revenue for them.
Okay, excellent. That was really helpful. Let's see if there's any other questions. Well, I don't see any other questions. So if anyone has any last minute questions and you're out there and you hear us, please just fire them in real quick, because we're going to wrap up the webinar here in just a few minutes. Again, that's internationalwatersubc@gmail.com. Send us a tweet or write on the YouTube page. Okay, here we go. Here's the last minute question. For the Arusha team, is the project approach to groundwater mostly embedded in geohydrology, more your hard sciences, or are you engaging with will drillers and local dowsers?
Okay, the project is a combination. So it's a multidisciplinary approach or interdisciplinary approach, in that we are studying the groundwater flow systems and dynamics, but also the changes that occur in it over time, but also the groundwater economy and the groundwater management, but also the different type of access. So in that process, we are also engaging with the people who are dealing with drilling, people who are dealing with Bowsers, and then tenants, landlords, in addition to different city level management or leadership that are involved. So it's not only strongly technical, but it's combined all these different aspects, both natural science and social science. It's also comprised of all these group, and because we want to try and create a space where people can come and decide the future of groundwater in Arusha city, that's why we have taken just an approach. If that is essential for this T group, I think Michelle would be able to add more there.
Yeah, not too much more to add, but again, reflecting on the MSc research that was done, we collect in trying to understand inequalities in access, or how affordable is access to boreholes. One of the MSc students collected different data sets, registered drillers and unregistered drillers, and the differences in who uses what driller, what the advantages are, how quick drilling can be done. Essentially, it's done on the weekend, so that the authorities are not present to observe, is widespread, and it raises again the difficulty in terms of data availability, since the city authorities only have an estimate of how many boreholes are out there based on the registered wells. There's a large number of unregistered, which no one can count.
Well, thank you for this. I think that's the last question we have. And I haven't seen anything on the Twitter. So I'm just going to thank everybody again for joining our panel. I know Professors Francis Cleaver and Dr. Whaley already left, but thank you, Professor Kooy and Dr. Komakech, for your help and for joining us today. Some of our panel is on Twitter, as are we. So you can find us at Internet Waters, INTERNAT Waters. International Waters was already taken when we got there. So you can find us there, and you can find links to all of our presenters' bios. If you just scroll through some of the most recent tweets, you'll find them. So, and if you find any of our presenters interesting or any of their work that you want to follow up with, go ahead and look them up on the internet and send them a quick email to their university email account. And I'm sure that they'll be willing to engage you and interested in learning more. I hope that everyone here today kind of found our insights provided by the panel really interesting and gave me a lot of material to think about myself as I continue writing and working. And I hope that it's going to help build you a lot of creativity and work for your own whatever research in your university or your job. So on behalf of the whole network of International Waters, we'd like to thank you for joining us here today. And if you want to learn more, please look us up on our website. You can just give us a Google and find us, and you can join our mailing list or follow us on Twitter. So please be in touch, and we're excited to have you. And this recording will be available on YouTube shortly, so you can share it with other people. So thank you again for joining us today, and we really appreciate your help. Thank you.